the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Queensland, and I'd like to welcome you here to this final Health Matters lecture for 2018 and to this wonderful venue. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we stand, the Turrbal and Jagera people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, but also acknowledge the extraordinary role of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff and students in the role of the university. I'd like to make some particular acknowledgements of some special guests. Janine Walker, the Chair of Metro South, thank you for coming along. Claire Sullivan, as your Chief Digital Health Officer, so I need to keep up with my titles. Luke McGrath, thank you very much for coming along from the Merchant Foundation. Celia Webby, who's down the back from the Chief Mission Related Services at the Children's Hospital. Andrew Hallen, I think, is here as well. Obviously our guest tonight, Susan Greenfield, thank you very much for coming a long way. We're grateful to you. And I think up the back, Sir John Took, who's in Melbourne, in Brisbane at the moment. Yes, I'm going to suffer for that slip, don't you worry, in Brisbane for today. I'd also like to acknowledge the members of the executive, the faculty here today, Kay Basford, Stuart Carney and Charles Gills. We have many others, representatives of government and industry, friends and donors of the faculty and the university, UQ colleagues, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. Now, just a couple of housekeeping matters before I start. In the unlikely event of an emergency, please follow the instructions of the staff, not me. If I could get you to turn your mobile phones to silent, that would be good. And for those that like to tweet, this hashtag Health Matters, if you wish to make some comments. So, as I say, welcome to this final in the series of Health Matters for this year. As you're probably aware, I've been in the role of Executive Dean for about the last 6 months, and this is the second, I think, of the Health Matters that I've had the privilege of chairing. I really like Health Matters. I like the venue. I like the way that we bring a broad audience in and the speakers that we've had. I think it's an extraordinary component of what we do, and it's an important part of our engagement. It's an opportunity to bring our alumni, our students, our staff together, and also to acknowledge the donors to the faculty and the university, of which there are many in the room, particularly around our scholarship programs and other research programs. This is an important part. Now, today's topic is neurodegenerative disorders, but particularly around dementia. And I'm going to begin just with a little personal story. Unfortunately, both my parents suffer from Alzheimer's disease. My father died a couple of years ago, my mother's now 91. But the detection of dementia in both of them was strange. They stopped being able to use the remote control for the television. I know, this worries people, doesn't it? But we went from a series of emergency calls, usually middle of the evening, where some of us would need to come around and rescue them because we made the mistake of buying them Foxtel, and that increased the complexity of the remote controls, and that was probably not a very good idea. But we became, aware that, and they were supported in the family home for a while, then they moved into support in a smaller home, and I'll have to say the provisions of the health service around ageing in place, I think have been extraordinary, and we were very grateful to those. But I think the ultimate remote control gesture was just towards the end, before unfortunately both Mum and Dad needed to move into residential aged care. Was when we received this urgent call that the television wasn't working. My son went down, and they handed him 7 remote controls and the telephone, and said, "We don't know what we're doing," and I've included the air conditioning remote control as well. So I toyed with the idea of a remote control index for detection, but it's it's a part of what we're doing. The prevalence of this illness is significant in our community, and there's often a very long life living, you know, in a place where a cognitive state has declined. And certainly, personally, for me, my mother's still down in Melbourne. I have this sort of notion of ephemeral happiness that when she's with me and the kids and so on, she's happy, and even if 10 minutes later she doesn't remember, that ephemeral happiness is significant. And so I think there are lots of things around that. But today we're going to be talking about perhaps some of the solutions to some of the disruptions, some of the thinking about this. And Susan Greenfield and I've known each other for now probably 4 or 5 years, in various things. Now, Susan's both an undergraduate and graduate from Oxford University with a DPhil in the Department of Pharmacology in 1977. She's held research fellowships in the Department of Physiology at Oxford, College de France, Paris, and NYU Medical Centre in New York. She is clearly a distinguished neuroscientist, broadcaster, and author. And in her previous trips, I was talking to Jean, has been a favourite by the ABC here, who does. In fact, she even was brave enough to go on Q&A, which can be a challenging environment. Now, Susan's been awarded 32 honorary degrees from a variety of universities, and in 2000 was selected as the honorary fellowship for the Royal College of Physicians. And many other acknowledgements of her work, the Golden Plate Award from the Academy of Achievement Washington, the Order Nationale de Légion d'Honneur of the French government, and the Australian Medical Research Society here in Australia. She's been involved as an entrepreneur as well in launching a number of biotech companies, and in fact I think a substantial amount of her work now relates to that. So a leader, a thought leader, a mentor, and I will say tomorrow morning, bright and early, Susan will be meeting with our early career researchers at UQ because she does that so well in that mentoring role. So it's great pleasure to invite Susan to the podium to deliver her address tonight, a novel approach to neurodegenerative disorders. Susan Greenfield.
Good evening now, not afternoon. Jeff, thank you so much for that generous introduction, and it's a huge pleasure to be here. When Jeff contacted me, he didn't really have to finish the sentence before I was saying, yes, I'm coming, because I love coming back to Australia, a country that I've come back to many times and I regard as home. And in fact, the one accolade you didn't mention, Jeff, I'm very proud of, is that in 2006 I was Honorary Australian of the Year. Yeah, exactly. Not that it gets me very far in customs, because I still have to go through the foreigners channel and everything, but it wasn't something going in Australia House for showing Australian values. I'm not quite sure what that was exactly, but anyway, I started the plaque and I'm very proud of it, and so I'm coming back to my honorary home. So, without too much preamble, it's great to see Jeff again. We were colleagues in Melbourne, as he said, where I was visiting. But I love coming up to Brisbane, not least at this time of year when I can gloat to everyone at home on the temperature, which is not good. Plus, escaping Brexit for about a week is great as well. Anyway, we've got an easier problem to solve, which is Alzheimer's, and I think that's okay, more or less. Right, so what I'm going to talk about is a disruptive approach, and a bit of a health warning. It is going to be technical because some of you may know I am giving 2 talks while I'm here. This one is about Alzheimer's and our work on Alzheimer's, and therefore it's inevitably going to get a bit technical along the way. So I hope that doesn't deter too many people who perhaps are not specialists in the area. And tomorrow I'm giving a general talk about the impact of technology on the brain. So there's no overlap in the slides whatsoever, so no excuse not to come to both. But I think the second one, if you are a non-specialist, probably would be more understandable immediately than this. But I hope nonetheless that you get the gist of this, even if you don't get all the nuances. And because it's very hard when you have a technical, some people are very technical and others who are not, trying to please everyone. But anyway, let's see how we get on. As you can see here, what I'm going to suggest to you is a novel idea to combat this terrible disease, and I don't think really we have to dwell too long on the challenge that dementia poses. This was from a little while ago, and you can see the global impact is 1 person every 3 seconds worldwide is going to be diagnosed. In the US alone, $2 trillion will be spent by 2030. And we're all familiar with this and we don't need to dwell on it. But I think Jeff highlighted very well something we do need to dwell on, which is it's not just the economic toll and burden on society, but the human one. Imagine loving someone, being close to them for 30, 40, possibly even 50 years, and then they don't recognise who you are. And whilst cancer and heart disease, say, are serious life-threatening disorders, you are still able to look through photos of your grandchildren and share memories and have that bond. This spiteful disease deprives you of that. So I think more than these other disorders, this one is a particularly cruel disease, and yet at the same time, there is no prospect at the moment of an effective treatment. There's been no new drug for Alzheimer's for the last 15 years. So we're all doing something wrong, and it's not good enough, and we need to sort it out. Alzheimer's is, as I'm sure most of you know, a disorder of older people, which is why it's increasing, because it's a disorder for older people. It's not a natural consequence of aging. As you can see here, clearly, as time is going on, the proportion of people of 65 and over is increasing, so you're going to see an increased number of people. So that's the bad news, as it were. Why does it take so long to treat? Why have we been struggling, given that there's a clear social and economic need and a societal need? What's the problem? Well, I think there's 2 main reasons why, until now, all approaches really have not borne much fruit. Here is reason 1. There is a time lag between the onset of the disease and the cognitive impairment, and so you're losing a valuable time window. This is so-called BRAC staging, named after some individuals called BRAC, who characterize the spread of degeneration in the brain, shown here in increasingly dark shades of green. And what you can do, that is post-mortem, is you can see that as you go on, the BRAC stage increases in number, and that bears a relationship to something called the mini mental status exam, which is the one thing really, the gold standard that's used to evaluate cognitive impairment. It's a scale of 0 to 30, where the lower your score, the worse your condition. You can see it correlates. But as you can see here, the MMSE only kicks in much later into the progression of the disease. So you can see here it's only really at 3 years in where MCI, that's mild cognitive impairment, has been apparent, that you start to get this this clearly measurable impairment in living people. So look before that, look at that red arrow. The neurodegeneration can start some 20 years before cognitive impairment. So you're kind of closing the door after the horse has bolted. If you then come along to the right of that picture and try and do something about it. What about all those things that have been going on during the period shown by the red arrow? That's one of the reasons why, to my mind, there's been no effective treatment, because people are treating the symptoms or the sequelae rather than the actual cause or the mechanism that drives Alzheimer's disease. The second reason is shown rather charmingly by these gentlemen here. I googled on one size fits all, and this was a rather, I think, engaging picture that captures the notion of one size fitting all, or more particularly one size not fitting all. And most people who work on Alzheimer's treat neurons rather like this suit, one size fits all. And so the kind of targets, the kind of processes they look at, all make the assumption that a neuron will respond in the same way to something. Now, we know that you can have a stroke and you don't get Alzheimer's. So why is it that only certain cells, if they're damaged, lead to degeneration? And this strikes me as such a blindingly obvious and simple question that you have to ask if you're going to understand it. It surprises me that no one has really addressed it, because we know that only certain neurons are prone to degeneration when they're damaged in the early stages. Indeed, during those crucial 20 years before the damage spreads to the outer layer of the brain, the cortex, which is associated, of course, with cognitive function and impairment. So, why haven't we addressed this? Amyloid, which we'll come on to, but not very much, which I'm sure you'll all have heard of, which is the most common and traditional target that people have used, posits that it will damage the cells, but they don't really say why only certain cells and not others, because amyloid is a bit of a sort of thug that just bashes most brain cells. So clearly, we need to look beyond the classic approach. The classic approach has got us nowhere, as shown here by these Times articles recently from the Times. So as you see, search for Alzheimer's drug flounders, and this man Howard Phillett. There's no doubt we have to start looking at things other than amyloid for drugs to target. And then again, this other quote from this guy Daniel Alcon: the disconnect between plaques and Alzheimer's, that's amyloid, should also have been a wake-up call to everyone that new approaches to Alzheimer's disease are needed, as almost everyone recognises now. So we were talking earlier about the notion of a paradigm shift. I think we are at the stage now when we are in desperate need of a paradigm shift, because the two reasons, the time lag and this notion that all cells are the same, isn't working. And what we've got to do is to think of a completely different approach to that. So my own suggestion is that we have to work out what is the basic mechanism of neurodegeneration. It's not good enough to say, oh, it's amyloid because amyloid's in the brain, or it's even this thing called tau, most of you are familiar with, because that's their own brain cells hyperphosphorylated. That's not good enough. You need a story. You need a narrative. Things don't just spontaneously combust. You need to know the process that drives neurodegeneration, especially in those first 20 years, because only then can you intervene and do something about it. So I've said here, only when the initial basic mechanism is identified that drives the continuing cycle. If you think about it, neurodegeneration is the opposite of most things in biology, which respects homeostasis. Most systems in biology try to bring things back to the state of normal. This doesn't. It's like a snowball. It goes on and on. So we have to work out, why is there this snowball, this ongoing feed-forward mechanism? If we knew what that was, then we could actually start to arrest it. Until we do, we are really floundering, and all we'll ever do is combat symptoms, and all we'll ever do, possibly, as this drug Aricept does, is slow things down initially. We need a different approach. So, we start with the anatomical clue. Neurodegeneration begins below the traditional areas, the so-called hippocampus and cortex, which I'm sure... how many neuroscientists are here, just out of interest? Put your hands up. Hands up who knows what the hippocampus is, please. Oh, very good, okay. Okay, that's a relief. Okay, so to spell out the hippocampuses and cortex. Okay, so we start with the anatomical clue, and what's really exciting is it seems that the neurodegeneration starts in this white hub of brain cells shown here, which are, as those who put their hands up will know, below the more sophisticated areas of the brain. And just because one has to stand up if one's challenged, I won't go into detail, in alphabetical order, these are a series of papers that actually show that the degeneration starts deep down in the cortex. By the way, if anyone wants this talk afterwards, with the wonders of modern technology, you can get it. You're very welcome to download it if you want. Okay, so Alzheimer's degeneration starts in this brainstem area, the core, and as you can see here in the locus ceruleus, this was shown a few years ago. If you look at Alzheimer's versus the controls, and the area shown in that black oblong, the locus ceruleus, it's already down 50%. And then, according to the, we're not even at Braak stage 2 here, and can you see the damage is really proceeding. And it's not until you get to Braak stage 5 and 6 that people will start to reach for the drugs or do the MMSE test. As I'll show you later, some people even regard stage 2 as a control, which is a bit of a worry. Anyway, let's think about these deep hub cells. Why should they be the first to go? What's special about them? And if we knew, we could intercept them before the damage spreads later. Well, let's have a think about that. When you're born, this is what you look like when you're in the womb, this is what you look like at 4 weeks gestation, before the brain is fully formed. But even at that stage, it's comprising and differentiating into two separate plates, the so-called alar and basal plate. Now, most neurons, the ones that form the cortex and so on, the hippocampus, will be derived from the alar plate. But what's really interesting, even at 4 weeks, already these cells, the hub cells are different, they come from the basal plate. Now that should tell us that they might be fundamentally different from the other brain cells. And if indeed those are the cells that are primarily vulnerable in Alzheimer's, that very distinction, that difference might be the thing that accounts for the degeneration eventually, or could do. So let's think what is special about these cells. Well, of the many features that do differentiate them, the one I want to draw your attention to is they are very sensitive to growth factors, to developmental factors, that they retain into adulthood. Okay? So whereas most cells will lose the sensitivity to the trophic factors to a certain extent, be therefore less plastic, these ones will retain their developmental mechanism. So what is the transmitter? That's the first question we all ask, isn't it? What's the transmitter? That's what I was in a pharmacology department, and that's our life's blood, it's transmitters. What's the transmitter? Well, guess what? There isn't one, because there's so many different types of transmitter. So clearly, these so-called global neurons don't rely on a particular conventional transmitter. Now, you'll see the term there, global neurons. That comes from the review that someone called Nancy Wolfred in 1996, which actually was the first person that actually alerted me to this difference and why it might be important. And what was very interesting is she was a psychologist, she wasn't a medic in any way, and I phoned her up saying, Nancy, don't you realise this distinction you've drawn? You've just highlighted all the major neurons that are lost in neurodegeneration. You can see them there. There's the basal forebrain, which is primarily in Alzheimer's. There's the substantia nigra and ventral tegmental area associated with Parkinson's. There's the motor neuron disease, motor neurons are there, and the raphe and the locus coeruleus are common to both those diseases. So clearly, you can see that this hub of cells, which is associated with these three major neurodegenerative diseases, have something in common. They come from the same part of the embryo, but it's not the transmitter. But there's something about them. Incidentally, this would account for the co-pathology you often see with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, because one could argue if part of the hub was damaged, you'd present with Alzheimer's, if another Parkinson's, but if the damage is extensive, then it would be, therefore, spreading across the adjacent areas. What could be the transmitter? Let's have a think about. Well, I hope you don't feel let down if I tell you it's an enzyme that you'll all have heard of, which is acetylcholinesterase. Because acetylcholinesterase is a neuromuscular junction. It's the most boring enzyme ever. It's the first enzyme we all learned. No. What's interesting about acetylcholinesterase is it can exist in places where it's not required to be an enzyme. It exists in places like the locus coeruleus, as you can see here, where it's co-localized with noradrenaline and there's no coacetyltransferase or acetylcholine inside. So for a long time now, this is a very old paper, as you can see, it's been posited, could acetylcholinesterase have a novel function? And in fact, the idea was first mooted by someone called Karksma in 1969, where he wrote, is the central cholinergic system overexploited because of this disparity where you frequently find cholinesterase in places where it hasn't got the opportunity to be an enzyme. There was even a book written in 1974 by someone called Anne Silver, and she very prophetically actually donated a whole chapter to cholinesterase as having other functions. Now, I know that's a bit of a heresy, but it's what has fueled my career. This is what I did my whole career on this notion, this heresy from people like Anne Silver and Karksma, who must take the credit for it. But I've developed this and tried to relate it because I think it's a really interesting idea and something where you have to face up to the facts. So, my own work is here. You can see this is the substantia nigra, the area lost in Parkinson's, and you can see the substantia nigra shown as this thin band, staining for tyrosine hydroxylase, the enzyme for dopamine, and therefore almost on a cell-to-cell basis showing also cholinesterase positivity. And then when I was in New York at NYU Medical Center, Rodolfo Linas and I looked at a light-emitting reaction where we could see in slices of brain, guinea pig brain, this is not human, slices of living guinea pig brain, that the substantia nigra, again shown here, top left marked by horseradish peroxidase, which has been transported down. There you can see a reaction we developed for real-time imaging of cholinesterase release, and you can see it corresponds to the substantia nigra. Cholinesterase is released, so not only does it exist in areas of the brain where it has no business to be, and indeed in non-neural cells like placenta, platelets, erythrocytes, in all those places, but on top of that, it's released Now, nature wouldn't go to all the effort of making a huge glycoprotein and have it released if it was just there to do nothing whatsoever. So what can it do? Well, it seems it's important, this ACHE, in development. And moreover, it seems that development and Alzheimer's in relation to ACHE are linked. Now remember, ACHE is in all those global cells, and in development, it exists primarily as a single form, a so-called G1 form, which is a single catalytic subunit. However, this is the embryonic rat brain. You can see the appearance of something called G4, that is a tetramer, whereas oligomerized, it's formed 4 catalytic subunits. And what's interesting is in in maturity, it's the G4 form that dominates. What's really interesting is this same pattern where you see in development one form of cholinesterase and in adulthood another is recapitulated in Alzheimer's. So this is human now, and in the control shown as ND, you can see that the ratio of G4 is higher to G1, whereas it's changed dramatically in Alzheimer's. Now, why is all this so interesting? Well, first of all, it shows that cholinesterase we should be looking at rather than classic transmitters, because that is in all the cells. And moreover, it seems to be in some way sensitive to Alzheimer's, some way sensitive to development. So what could be the connection? And why does it switch anyway from G1 to G4? Why would it want to do that? Well, if you think about it, what we're going to say is the monomer will lack the ability to oligomerize by definition. And what I want to sell you is the idea that you can see here that within these disulfide bonds, you have at the end here, you can see at the C-terminal end, some peptides that we call T14 and 15 because of the number of amino acids in them, which have an interesting homology with amyloid. And moreover, I'd like to suggest that therefore, that what we're looking at is whenever you see G1, it's the footprint for the fact that T14 peptide has been released. Bear in mind, you see this profile in development and in Alzheimer's. So could it be that the essential part, the essential molecule, is not the whole cholinesterase enzyme, but the C-terminal part of it, this T14 fragment, that is cleaved when it's needed, and it's needed in development, trophic factors we've seen, but then it's revived inappropriately in maturity. So we'll come back to that, but that's the idea. This is just a series of papers showing that T14 has the same bioactive effects as the cholinesterase. And here you can see Dr. Jekyll, it's good. You can see it's enhancing the growth in the neurites, as obligingly shown by the red arrows compared to the controls. But what's really interesting is in the rat brain, you can see here, it declines, the T14 levels go down as the animal matures. And what's really interesting is if you look at rats, I'm not a great expert on rat husbandry, but up to about 14 days, you can see there they are. But then they open their eyes at 14 days and start walking around and becoming the rats we know and love. What's really interesting is if you look at rat blood at these stages, what's really interesting is you can see the T14, for those of you who are not familiar with these Western blots, it's that black band. You can see that at 7 days and 14 days in rat blood, in plasma, it's very marked, but as they go through this important developmental step, so suddenly it switches off. So clearly, I don't really know quite why, but I'm not that interested in rat development. This is simply used to show that in the blood, T14 will reflect events in the brain. That might be useful for a biomarker or a diagnostic if we're thinking about it. And moreover, T14 is of relevance in Alzheimer's. Now, why is that? It's because agents that aid growth, as T14 clearly does, can turn toxic, and they do so because of the amount of calcium that they will trigger going into the cell. Calcium can be Dr. Jekyll, but it can also be Mr. Hyde, because if too much goes in, it will not be mobilized, and it will enter the mitochondria, compromise oxidative phosphorylation, so you get a leakage of electrons that form superoxides, and that disintegrates the cell membrane. So what happens, as you can see, over time, this is our own work with T14, at different periods, at 1 hour, what was it? 1 hour, 12 hours, and 24 hours, you can see that initially it was trophic, it was causing a greater growth of the neurites, but as we increased the time, then it became toxic. Similarly, dose, the low dose, this is electrophysiology, can enhance the calcium spikes, as shown here, high dose suppresses it. But what's really interesting, this is not my work, our work, but it's, I think, a very seminal paper by Emmer and Schramm in '96. What they showed was that calcium varied in its effects according to the age of the cells, and these two graphs are only, as you can see, 7 days apart, but the tolerance to calcium has changed by a factor of 3 if you look at the lower one. So what's really interesting is, forget about duration or dose, age. And that might be the difference between whether it's trophic in the development and toxic in a mature brain. Let's develop that idea. So here we have the normal cells, and bear in mind, you're healthy and normal, and T14's in them. 20 years before you're going to see any cognitive symptoms, say you have damage of some sort. Now, if you have damage to the cortex or wherever, you'll have a stroke, recover, partial recover. Here, for whatever reason, it doesn't have to be specific. It can be a decline in scavenging mechanisms, or it could be local ischemia, it could be anything, that will then, if these cells are damaged, they're going to try and grow again because they've retained the ability to do so. They will do so by mobilizing T14 to help them grow, because it's a developing thing. And as they do that, this time, because it's in the context of a mature brain, the calcium, even the same amount of calcium going in, will now be toxic. It will be Mr. Hyde. And this will carry on in these groups of cells, and it's only when the damage spreads to their projection areas, which is the cortex, that you'll then see the cognitive symptoms. Only then you're going to say, aha, they can't operate the remote control anymore. Yeah? I'm afraid. So if this is the situation, you can see we've got a wonderful chance to do something before we get to the bottom right. So what we need to do first is we need to summarize the story, because I'm aware that it's 40 years of my life suddenly described in 30 minutes is quite spooky. So we've seen that kinesis is present in neural, and I've said non-neural cells without its normal substrate acetylcholine, and it doesn't function as an enzyme. It's released into cerebrospinal fluid, and it's detectable locally from brain areas linked to neurodegeneration, and this release is visualized in real time and monitored online in the moving animal. We've done that in one of the papers. I just showed you the brain slice one. Even when the enzymatic site is irreversibly blocked, and we've done that very chillingly with sarin and soman provided by the chemical defense establishment, I've put down, which is interesting. ACH still has electrophysiological actions that we don't attribute to hydrolyzing acetylcholine. What the action is to promote growth through modulated calcium, but in high doses it becomes toxic. And the key part of the molecule we've identified that's responsible for these effects is the 14-mepeptide, which has a homology to amyloid beta, independently enhances calcium currents, and which in turn can have this excitotoxic effect. So that's the story so far. So what we want to do now is measure it and test it and see if it's right. So we have an antibody. That's T14, they're the amino acids, and the antibody recognizes the epitope VHWK such that if we cap it, as you can see on the right, then it no longer is effective. It doesn't recognize amyloid, it doesn't recognize full cholinesterase, it doesn't recognize the bigger molecule T30, the 30 amino acids that we've also worked with, which comprises also at the C-terminal a 15 amino acid in a sequence. So we know it's that epitope and it's that molecule that gives us what we're about to see, so it's proof of concept. So we want to show that neurodegeneration is an inappropriate activation of development. And you've seen, I think, these rat brains. Now on the right, look at the human midbrain, where post-mortem Alzheimer tissue, you can see that the Alzheimer brain, you have double the level of T14 compared to age-matched controls. And similarly, it's linked to the early stages because I showed you those black pictures before. If you do immunohistochemistry and stain the cells for T14, you can see there is a corresponding increase in the signal of the density. You could say, well, we're amyloid people. And I'd like to say, one doesn't want to throw out babies with bathwaters, and clearly it's a complex picture. And amyloid, and indeed this hyperphosphorylated tau, play their part there, characteristic for many people. But what we are suggesting is they're not the story, they are the sequela. What is the story? What's driving amyloid and tau is T14, and we've shown that in cell cultures here, where we're looking, as you can see, both amyloid and tau, and when we apply our peptide, it's significantly increased above controls. Moreover, in brain slices that you can keep alive in the rat, and this is a very happy technique where you have a coronal brain slice and you section it down the midline, so you have one side control, the perfect control, and the other side that you can treat, as shown here. And when we do that, you can see again there's an increase in amyloid and tau when we incubate one side alone with the toxin. We've also looked at behavioural studies, well not we, but collaborators in Canada, and this is still early and ongoing, and we've had to switch labs, and I'll happily talk about all that in the Q&A. But they have found with this water maze, which is a measure of cognitive impairment, T14 seems to be producing effects clearly stronger than a standard neurotoxin for hippocampal function. They said exciting. We know also that this peptide increases the permeability of the blood-brain barrier, which I'll remind you, when that happens, that's indicative of neurological damage. And you can see here the T15, which is the inert part of the big molecule that we have made. It's done nothing, rather as phosphoglycosylation hasn't done anything, but you can see here a dose-dependent T30 effect in increasing, and again here. So the long-term goal of NeuroBio, of what I've been working on, NeuroBio is my company, by the way, which I'll say more about at the end. On with that, if we've identified the pivotal molecule that drives neurodegeneration, that we've proved is excessive in the brain, that we know drives amyloid and tau, we know we can measure it in the blood, now let's go to work and try and do something that can help. What about having a biomarker that could detect the degeneration before the symptoms appear? That is to say, within that 20-year window. That alone, by the way, let me just go back, that alone would be helpful, because if you could start medication 20 years earlier, who knows, even Aricept, which we know only slows things down, but actually if you could start it earlier, it might be that that's effective, and so you know, it would be a good thing to do. If you had a medication that stopped any further cell death, even if you'd already had the diagnosis, that would be, again, a marvellous advance, because you wouldn't get any worse. But put the two things together. Imagine going to your GP for a routine blood test like you have for cholesterol, and they say, well, there's good news and bad news. I'm afraid the bad news is you have an aberrant marker that's different, and according to this chart here, you are going to get confusion and memory loss in about, in this case, in your case, about 5 years' time. However, the good news is we now have a medication that stops any more cells dying. So take that medication now, even though you have no symptoms, and then you'll never get the symptoms. So that's the dream, so to say. And it would entail a routine blood test and then a medication, routine medication. Nothing fancy, nothing ethically compromising, no fancy brain cell transplants or things like that. It'd be hopefully quite straightforward to roll out. So that's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to do with this company, NeuroBio, which Jeff mentioned briefly. This is a completely spoofed product. You can't buy it. It's my number two enjoyed making this up. And what we're trying to do is to develop an early detection method. So we could at least have some form of diagnosis, easy diagnosis, other than the MMSE score, which is not a reliable or very sensitive one in early stages, and even better if it was prognostic. So at the moment, you can have scans that detect amyloid in your brain, but you can have normal brains that are amyloid positive. And moreover, PET scans are not, they're not without stress and time and expense. You can have the mini mental status exam, but that's only sensitive in the later stages. Or you can have the BRAC staging, but that's only possible really when you're dead, so that's not overly helpful. So none of these can detect early. So this is, now we're up against a problem as well, because what if we have a blood test and I say, look, I've got this change, what do I benchmark it against? Because if the person hasn't deteriorated and they're not dead and they're not, so it's very hard. But what we've done now is to actually try and develop something that would come in ahead of those other indicators. And very crudely, what we've done is a combination of antibody-based assays where it seems, and this is very early on, that what we can do is a blood test can discriminate between, in normal people, cognitively normal people, scoring the same. It appears to be able to discriminate between amyloid positive and amyloid negative in the brain, which means you would avoid having a PET scan if this holds up. And then again, you can see using the Western blot technique the two techniques in the middle both show a similar level for amyloid-positive brains, but then the ones with the pathology, mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's, are significantly different again. So it seems that we can now use this. This is very early stage, but we're very excited about developing it further, to use it as a diagnostic marker. You'd have a routine blood test, and there we are, no need for PET scans, and then you could actually allocate someone to one of three non-overlapping groups. Controls are amyloid negative, healthy, those that were amyloid positive with T14, and finally those that had full-blown pathology. That would be very useful because for drug companies even, discriminating and refining a cohort that might be more needing to benefit from the drug development would be very powerful. This is very preliminary. Could we apply this to other degenerative diseases, for example, motor neuron disease? And you can see this is very early, so we're very excited. But this was a so-called ROC curve, where, for those who are not familiar with it, the deviation away from that diagonal line indicates the power of it as a potential diagnostic test. But this is very early, and we're now, with about 20 samples only, we're now doing it more with samples supplied by Queen Mary College and someone called Dr. Malaspina. So, right, now what about the therapy? Because if we're using this to detect therapy, the target for the alpha-7, for the T14, is the alpha-7 receptor, which is one of the most powerful calcium ionophores in the brain. Traditionally, it's regarded as a nicotinic cholinergic receptor, but it is very promiscuous, and guess what? It's on all of the cells that I've mentioned, and on non-cholinergic cells, because the primary ligand can be choline, which in turn you can get from the diet. The reason we have identified the alpha-7 receptor as being the receptor that will be the target of our peptide is because it's very powerful for calcium. In transgenic Alzheimer mice, you have, if it's stimulated, you have upregulation. It binds amyloid, rather more specifically. It's implicated in Alzheimer's already, but for our purposes, the giveaway was that as cholinesterase is appearing in the brain during development, bear in mind it's not enzymatic, it can appear in the brain in a very transient way in key brain areas. And as it's doing that during development, so it co-localizes perfectly with the alpha-7. This is from the work of Broider and someone called Robertson. So again, that's a clue that you don't ignore. Look at 10 days, where the ACHE, little a, b, c, d, in the A section, you can see the correspondence in E down there of the binding of the alpha-7. So it's well, I say obvious, it's obvious that this would be the thing to try, which we did. And here you can see cholinesterase enhancing the calcium currents in the presence of a blocker of NMDA. So it would be very likely to be that. And this is proof positive, it is that it is the alpha-7. When we work with oocytes, these are eggs that have nothing, but we transfected them with the alpha-7 receptor. And you can see here the T14 peptide. The little blip on the left is acetylcholine or choline causing activation. On the right, the longer bar shows application of our peptide, which is doing nothing whatsoever until it co-occurs with the little blip, and then you can see it's enhanced the current now. Whereas an equivalent peptide sequence of butyrylcholinesterase, which also has acetylcholine, that's done nothing. So that tells us it's a modulator, that it modulates calcium entry, that it isn't the primary agent, but it will just enhance it or not, which makes it a much more attractive form for developing a drug, because it's not going to shut off all calcium. So we can show here that it's bungratoxin sensitive. Here we have the protection shown right of the peptide with bungratoxin on the left. The cells are in pretty poor shape with the peptide alone. And the histogram on the bottom shows again a rather toxic effect of the peptide when it's applied. Bungratoxin on its own does nothing, but in the presence of bungratoxin, the peptide then is ineffective. We know that the calcium going in, as well as having an immediate effect, can increase the production of its own target. You can see here in control cells and the peptide control we use, there's very little effect. The alpha-7s are shown by the green fluorescent circle. T14 in 24 hours enhanced production of the receptor. This we've also shown in vivo in the rat brains that we had from the Canadians. So it seems that T14 not only lets in toxic amounts of calcium, but it also produces its own target, so it can carry on doing its evil job even more. And then these are the papers, again, available if you want to see them. Okay, so far so good. Let me go back. This was where we were at about 2013, 2014. And we were obviously needing now to devise a drug that would intercept the binding of the T14 to the allosteric site of the alpha-7. And a lot of people are very sniffy about this. A lot of pharma people I spoke to say, oh no, the alpha-7 receptor, we've tried that in Alzheimer's, it doesn't work, lots of drugs don't work, you know, so why should you be right on this? And if you think about it, if it doesn't work when it's been given in a pathological situation, it's because in an Alzheimer brain, that receptor site is going to be occupied by a naturally occurring T14. And being a naturally occurring agent is going to be very hard to dislodge. So any man-made or woman-made drug is not going to dislodge it as easily as people would have predicted or hoped. So what could we do? How could we be different? Well, what we thought of was actually turning the peptide against itself. And this is what we did. We cyclized it, that's to say bent it into a circle. So it then became inert, but it was still there, and it's still bound to the receptor. So now you've got the evil chemical itself, but bind to the receptor and not able to do anything, which is a much more powerful way of preventing the endogenous toxin doing its job compared to just some man-made or woman-made drugs. So that's what we did, and that's the two papers that came out in 2016 on the basis of that formed the basis of Neurobio, formed the basis of the company. So just to summarize, here's the T14 binding to an allosteric site. There is we call it MBP14, and that's why we think it works, because of the peptide that is present in the brain in excess. As we've seen, it's doubled. And when we compare it, it has a very high affinity versus galantamine. If you look at the binding compared to galantamine, which is the drug that's out there, that's comparable, that's licensed, you can see our binding is 1.1 micromolar compared to about 50, it's 50 times better at binding. And sensitivity to blocking amyloid is about 100 times more sensitive. Amyloid blocks at 100 nanomolar, this at 1 nanomolar in this particular preparation. And we've looked at the different stages for screening, where you look at the immediate action, toxicity, immediate action, then the subsequent cell death, so calcium going in, the cell dying, compensation by the parent coenesterase molecule, and we can look at it in those three ways: calcium increase, cell viability, coenesterase release, and in all cases we find, as you can see here, that the MBP, which is the third one along in every case, has completely reversed the effects of the T30 and indeed of the amyloid, which is secondary to this. So we have a drug, or could have a drug, that does the job of combating both. What we have now shown in the rats is if you look at how the T14 binds to the receptor with something called co-IP, co-immunoprecipitation, what you can see there, shown by the dark band, again the age-dependent decrease in the binding of the peptide to the receptor. And that is the same in humans, where if you look at the N and the AD, you can see there's a clear band in Alzheimer's, but not in neurodegeneration, and there's the significance. What Gregory Cole has done, who's collaborated with us at UCLA, is then to look at MBP in the post-mortem brain and to see its binding. And remember I mentioned that it seems strange, but he nonetheless calls it a control at Braak stage 2. Perhaps he can't get control brains, I don't know. But if you look at the black, you can see that's the binding of T14 to the receptor in the control condition. And as you can see, the Alzheimer's is much higher for binding, just as we've been seeing. But as you introduce increasing doses of MBP, as shown on the horizontal axis, by the time you get to the 1.13 micromolar, already what has happened is the levels are not significantly different from control levels. So imagine if you could do that in a living brain, with all other things, if you could reduce that to the same as the control brain. That is the goal. Okay, so we've also shown that MBP is displacing its endogenous compound, again with this brain size technique, where the T14 enhances, the exogenous peptide enhances the production of T14. If you give MBP alone, the natural signal is reduced, whereas the inert peptide has no effect at all. Now, I don't want to give the game away. So far so good, just to summarize. We have a drug that combats a pivotal signaling molecule that appears to be toxic in Alzheimer's, driving production of amyloid and tau, and able indeed through the alpha 7 receptor to antagonize that action and reduce it to the level of controlled brains. Big problem, it won't get into the brain, it's 2 kilodaltons. So we do have a program for refining it and getting small molecules. But wouldn't it be great if it could get into the brain, given it's performing so well? And as you'll be aware, there's the blood-brain barrier, which won't let it through, and there's a load of problems trying to do it with intravenous or sub-Q or orally. But there is another route that we could try, this one, nasal. And so this was a huge excitement for us, because I don't know who suggested it. I do owe them a drink. I don't know, well, someone in the group suggested, why don't we just try it doing nasal? And what we found, this is out of scale, of course, the mouse brain isn't the same size as the pea bottle, but what we found, what we wanted to find was whether the MBP displaced the naturally occurring evil chemical. And this is what we found, to our delight, that as you can see, even within 10 minutes, there was a significant difference from the controls in displacing it. This is naturally occurring T14 displaced. It was maximum at 4 hours, and even at 8 hours, it was still doing the job. So this suddenly became something that we wanted to think of as a proper drug. And this was promoted also further by the fact that we now have a patent, not just filed, but granted. The patent was granted, and it's granted in Australia with very wide use in Australia. We're very pleased. But we now have a worldwide patent granted, so we're very proud of the certificate there. So just to summarise, it's granted, it's inert, it appears selective to only one target, it displaces naturally occurring T14, clear demonstration of a direct dose-dependent target interaction, it has distinct profile in Alzheimer's versus the controls, and it protects, blocks and reverses the actions of T14 and amyloid in a wide range of preps and protocols, and intranasal seems to work. And there's also a possible application, which I won't go into unless Jeff asks me, to cancer. And these are our screening techniques that we use, and there's the 3 papers that we published recently showing how it can have protective effects, reversal effects, and it competes. So these are different techniques we use in-house, as shown in these papers, for characterizing the MBP. And there you see the optical imaging, where we can now screen different types of drugs, as shown by the green ticks and the red crosses. And that's our IP. So, what is neurobiology? To summarize, we've asked only why certain cells are vulnerable. We've identified the key pivotal toxic peptide underlying the process in the vulnerable cells. We've shown it's a feature of the Alzheimer's brain. We're developing a possible blood test that could be a biomarker. We've identified the target as the alpha 7. We've designed a blocker of the T14, which is T14 itself, that could intercept and inspire an effective drug therapy. And we've suggested a novel theory of Alzheimer's that accounts for all the known clinical facts. For example, the time lag for cognitive symptoms, the pathology, and the selective vulnerability. And above all, we challenge accepted dogma. I don't care if we're right or wrong, but I do care passionately that at least we're trying to be different from everyone else. So here's the summary. The long-term goal, which you've seen, we now have neurobio blood test. The medication, then eventually they are going to be 100 and knowing how to use remote controls. And wouldn't that be a wonderful prospect to work to? Thank you very much. Yes, mine's on.
Mine, I can stand stand up here maybe. Which looks rather asymmetrical now. So I'm interested in challenging the dogma. As you know, I'm from Melbourne. I sometimes think I'm still in Melbourne, obviously from today's comment. And I grew up with Colin Masters and others around me, in which the amyloid hypothesis has driven an enormous, well, it's driven careers, and it's also driven an enormous amount of research. In disruptive thinking like this, what's the response been? I mean, you've said that sometimes some, they're not sort of keen to hear.
Yeah. Well, that's a really interesting question, and I think many people in this room may have experienced that But to be fair, if you are working on something for decades, and it's something you've put a lot of passion and time into, it's a bit like having a kid, you know. You care, something you spend a lot of time and effort on is important to you by definition. So if someone comes along and says, well, my kid's better than your kid, of course you'll get pushback. Of course I would if someone came along with that, yeah, because it's your theory. And a lot of non-scientists don't realise this about science, is that we are not the open-minded, completely unbiased individuals, you know? That we, you know, people may think we are. No, we have our pet theories. As I say to non-scientists, look, if we all did an experiment, even by the next stage, when we were designing the next thing to do, we'd probably be different, we'd interpret it in different ways, we'd immediately bring in our own signature to that particular science program. So science is not like being, I don't want to be rude about airline pilots, you know, where we hope they all do the same job in the same way, let's hope, yeah? Where we're much more like writers or musicians, or, you know, that it's actually highly personal, highly individual. And because of that's why we're also nasty to each other, you know, so bitchy and so angry, because it's something that's you, it's your identity, it's not just a job, yeah? So because, which I'll say to your folk tomorrow, you know. So because of that, it's very hard, you know, to convince you. Of course you're going to get sales resistance, of course you're going to get cynicism. Up to a point, that's healthy, and it's important that you are in the crucible where people bring out the very rigorous checks and balances. They want to see the controls, they want the peer reviews, they want external validation. Of course. What is the problem, and I've sometimes had, is when people, we were talking earlier, a bit like Trump with climate change, where you just say, I don't believe it. I've had that in the past, I don't believe it. And you say, well, so what am I supposed to do? And that's the difficulty, is where that natural cynicism, that healthy desire to have the checks and balances, when that shades into frank prejudice, that's where we have problems. And I think, but as regards amyloid and Colin Masters, even as I saw him 2 days ago, and we had a coffee, and he's still banging on about amyloid, obviously. But I did say to him, I said, well, look, there's enough room for us all here, you know, if you're right, but for 15 years it hasn't, you know, been very successful. And part of the reason is that amyloid, they just study it as though it's disembodied, it's just there. You have to put it in the context of different anatomical regions and how those regions are behaving in different places. If your story can't accommodate neuronal selectivity, as to the best of my knowledge, amyloid cannot, then I would say it's a theory that is wanting, as I said to him. But no, as you know, we get on very well. It's been a long, now.
So questions. So I think we've got microphones. So we've got a question here. Yeah.
Hi. Fantastic talk.
Thank you.
There's tremendous interest these days in the gut microbiome and how the gut microbiome controls things in the brain, especially through the gut-brain axis.
Oh, yes.
So, and some kind of bacteria can produce neurotransmitters. So do you think there can be some kind of intervention through the gut microbiome, through the diet, or something which probably stops neurodegeneration?
Well, all things are possible. My own discovery, and I hadn't realised this before, was just how good a route the nasal route was. I don't know if there's one here who's an expert on nasal delivery of drugs, but so for me personally, and the tack I personally want to focus on, is a nasally administered drug for interception, because that is focusing just on the brain and will therefore hopefully avoid side effects that you would normally see if you were looking at the gut or looking at other bits of the body and they were circulating. That's not to say, you know, it couldn't be interesting. Okay, well, let's give an excuse to mention metastases now. If you say neurodegeneration is an inappropriate form of development, that's what cancer is. Okay? And in 2006, we gave people at Imperial College a peptide, and we published at that time the fact that the peptide could actually promote metastases in certain breast cancer cell lines, but not others. And when we got hold of the MVP, in collaboration with someone called Chris Pepper, who was then at Cardiff, he's now at Brighton, he actually showed that the MVP reduced the rate of migration to the same level as non-metastatic cells, which we published in a journal called Oncotarget, a target I'd never heard of. And we then followed up with an editorial, Cancer and Alzheimer's Disease, two sides of the same coin. The reason I mentioned that is because I mentioned the patent, but also because we might want, in that case, to have a drug that did access much wider targets than just the brain.
So the microbiome, I think, is a very interesting topic and possibly might be one good for Health Matters in the future, because I think there's a lot claimed and I'm not quite so sure how much proven. We've got fecal transplants and inflammatory bowel disease and a number of other things. So I think it'll be interesting because it is involved in almost every discussion nowadays. Yes?
Yes. As an old endocrinologist, I feel much more enlightened now, but I'd just like to ask that these neurodegenerative changes that you've described through the word known as Alzheimer's, is this unique to the human? Does it occur in aging primates? In other words, is there an animal model?
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. It's a super question. Let me unpack it. There are people that claim, and I don't know if there's any dog owners here, that dogs can suffer cognitive impairment and have Alzheimer's. It might be that the dog's just getting a bit old, I don't know, but people do claim that. To the best of my knowledge, which doesn't mean to say it's completely exhaustive, I'm not aware of much being done on that. However, the animal model question is a really important one, and if I may, Chairman, I'd like to just elaborate on that. Obviously, if you are testing a drug, you need to do it in non-humans. Obviously, first of all, rodents. And whilst with diseases such as Parkinson's disease or motor neuron disease, you can look at survival extension or you can look at movement. Clearly, with a cognitive impairment, it's much harder. And moreover, whilst in Parkinson's disease, one can just obliterate the substantia nigra, knowing that that is a very focused lesion in that disease, it's much harder if you don't know what the cause is in the first place to devise a model for it. It's a bit like I say to people about consciousness and computers. Say, well, how can you build a conscious computer if you don't know what it is you're going to put in it? So if we don't know, or if people don't know, what is the core impairment or process or mechanism in Alzheimer's, if you don't know that, how can you reproduce it in an animal model? Now, that said, the obvious models to use are ones where they overexpress amyloid, and they're the ones that are now used, where you have transgenic animals that overexpress amyloid. It's a moot point whether these are good or bad models, whether they're faithful. As always, it depends what you're trying to show. But frankly, we have nothing else. That said, one long-term application of our work might be we could use T14, introduced intracerebrally as an animal model. But it's a really important point because there's no point in having a transgenic model where you overproduce amyloid and then you say, aha, it's amyloid. It's a bit of a vicious circle. Yeah? So thank you for flagging that question of animal models. As far as I know, we can't use pet dogs that have got old, but people do document it in that. And I wouldn't be at all surprised, given it's a very basic feature of the brain, if it didn't become apparent in other species. It's just that in the wild and in nature, usually nature has a much more deft way of dealing with that. And I think a species that had cognitive impairment would probably not last as long as your parents did.
I think it's an interesting thing, the alignment of our animal models with the kind of human disease. And I mean, in my area of rheumatology, there's been a number of models favoured, collagen-induced arthritis and so on, where this has been the test bed of every drug. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It's an interesting, and as I suppose we use animal models less, we look at organoids and cell culture and so on. It'll be interesting how that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting issue because it depends, as always, what are you measuring? If you're measuring, that doesn't mean to say if you have a transgenic amyloid mouse that is cognitively impaired, doesn't mean to say that normally in humans it's amyloid. Yeah, it's just a question of.
Yes, question.
How long?
Oh,
if you're right.
Yes.
If you're
Good
right.
question.
Yeah. And I like when you're right. It'd be good if someone was right, effectively right. Yeah. If you're right, how long until we have a combination of both of, knowing that this is likely to happen to you, which in the absence of treatment is potentially awful, and having an effective treatment?
Sure. I think knowing it is going to happen to you, yes, it is awful, but you don't have to take the test. It's a bit like the old AIDS suggestion. If you could take the existing medication that's already licensed, and we know it's more effective in early stages, who knows, it might be better for you and slow things down by taking it before while you're presymptomatic. Yeah? And in terms of the development, in our case, and this is in the context of the research, we would be hoping to go to phase 1 clinical trials, we hope in about 2 years. We've just finished toxicology studies, which are proving we've now got the tolerated dose intranasally in mice, and we now have to go to the animal models of the very unsatisfactory transgenics, but we have nothing else. And I'd like to think that if that looks promising by Easter, we could then do the second thing you have to do, which is go to a non-rodent animal, and then it becomes very regulatory and very serious, which I'm told by those who know much more about it than me, that will take about a year, and then we'll do phase 1 trials, which is no way towards saying that we've got the drug established and so on. It merely shows you don't get side effects in that. In terms of the diagnostic, I would like to think it would be about 3 years, 2 to 3 years. But of course, that's an easier thing to have on the market than it is to have a drug that could potentially do harm. So that, as we all know, takes much, much longer. So the timescale isn't tomorrow, but it is realistic at least. You know, it's like within the next decade, I'd like to think. If we're right. But or you know, there might be other people giving seminars around the world just like I am now, being asked that question. From my view, I think it's not now like as it used to be, devising a time travel machine or a perpetual motion machine, and completely beyond the realms of feasibility. If we're right, you can see there's a clear path and we're probably right on. I'd like to think within 10 years.
So the interesting design of the clinical trial, because you get early detection, and then you're introducing your intervention.
Sure.
And then, you know, so you have to design those quite, it's quite an interesting design.
So this is why we've started looking at motor neuron disease. Yeah? As everyone I'm sure knows, it's a very aggressive neurodegenerative condition, typically with a lifespan of about 2 years. And the current drug, riluzole, in the UK, prolongs life by 3 months, and that's as good as you can get. So this is a very aggressive disease where if this was what we tested the MVP on, one looks then for life extension, simple survival, which is a more straightforward condition. Because if we're saying cognitive impairment only comes on in the much later stages, then clearly that's not really the point. We want to do it in the early stages, which is why what we would have to do is develop a companion biomarker, as it's called, validate our biomarker, and then show that when you're doing that, that corresponds to the disease, and it can be slowed down with the drug. But the other point about doing motor neuron disease is it has orphan drug status, which means it gets to regulation much faster.
Yes, I hadn't realised how much the US had placed incentives within the orphan drug. So orphan drugs are for diseases, I think less than, I can't remember the proportion, rare diseases, and there are now substantial benefits to the regulatory environment. And I think it provides you with a monopoly for a period of time. So it is an interesting part. Any other questions? Yes.
Hello. Oh, sorry.
Oh, yes.
Look, thank you so much for your presentation. Look, I'm absolutely not a scientist, which is going to become...
Thank you for sitting through that then.
Well, look, my brain yearns for knowledge, and I was going to say, not being a scientist is going to become very obvious from my question.
They're always the hardest one.
I'm just wondering if you could clarify what you were saying about calcium. What I was hearing was something, and tell me if I'm incorrect, but as the calcium, am I right, crosses the blood-brain barrier, gets into the center of the brain, that it somehow stimulates the development of these toxic cells. And look, I'm sitting here thinking of the mountains of, the numbers of calcium tablets I'm taking every morning.
Okay, let me reassure you. Calcium is everywhere, all right? Every cell will have calcium working with it, yeah? And it's very delicately balancing. Taking calcium orally has nothing to do with it suddenly enhancing the entry into key brain cells and giving you Alzheimer's. Absolutely not.
Although interestingly, calcium supplementation has been quite debated in recent times, because in my area, of course, it was around supplementation for the prevention of osteoporosis or the treatment of osteoporosis. And there is now this sort of delicate balance that it may be that your vitamin D levels are actually more important than calcium.
Let me just give you a 2 seconds physiology lesson. Right? Calcium can only get into cells in a regulated way, through little channels, and those channels in turn are regulated by these things called receptors. Yeah? So don't worry about calcium. It's more how the gatekeepers that enter into the cell or not that's the problem.
I think we had a question in the front. Oh, okay. So, oh no, we've got one more, so we'll make this the last one.
Well, thank you. Just a question from the left field. The herpes viruses, CMV, I've sort of read recent papers. It seems to be an association between that and the onset of Alzheimer's to some degree. Could you possibly expand on that?
Well, okay, but the classic response is it's not my area, so I wouldn't have that. But many things are linked to the early onset or the predisposition to Alzheimer's. I could hand wave and guess that if you're compromised in a certain way, that things aren't working as efficiently as they might, perhaps in terms of the free radicals and the scavenging mechanisms, which will eventually render a cell dying. My own view is that it might be lots of things that cause the initial damage, whether it could be a virus possibly, but things like these increase in free radicals, or small local stroke that you don't recognise, or some toxins that are there, or a blow to the head from someone, and all those things will accumulate, and then once it gets to a critical mass, the cell can't cope, it dies. And if it's in those global areas, then it will ricochet and become back to
So, it remains, firstly, to thank our speaker. I think what we've had today is a sort of tour de force of the science, and yes, very much in the graphs and kind of basic elements, the building blocks of what we all use in science, and some of that may have been, confronting to see how all of that works together, but that's science. I think we've also seen how disruption, because I think extant theories that are on challenges are actually a problem for us, as a community, that there's other forms of productivity that are rewarded by maintaining a certain direction, and sometimes it's not good to be the disruptor. It can be, but I think the third aspect of what we've heard tonight is hope. And obviously, and I began with a very personal experience with both parents developing Alzheimer's disease. There's probably not much there in the final phase, almost in the final phases, but I think there is this sort of notion that this is going to be an increasing and substantial problem for our community, and we need disruption, we need other ways of thinking about it, and of course of supporting and the human aspects of this which are useful. So I wonder whether you could join with me in thanking our speaker, Susan.
Thank you.
So we'd also like to thank everybody that organised this event. This is always a complex act to get everything done, and so thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for coming along, all of our guests tonight. And we do have some refreshments and food down on the Riverside Cafe. So one